Today we're going to be discovering the ultimate limits of BTD5 freeplay with the help of world record holder Matteo Blooner. He has already managed to surpass around 10,000 in this game, something that would have been deemed completely impossible just a couple years ago. And you know what's really crazy? It turns out that around 20,000, 30,000, or even 50,000 and beyond isn't off the table either. You just have to be prepared to dedicate literal years of your life to having BTD5 running non-stop on your computer. And to really put things into perspective, I'd like to also discuss a few other times in this game's history where it seemed as though the limits of free play had already been reached, only for someone or something to absolutely blow the lid off said limits. For nearly 3 years after BTD5 initially launched in late 2011, the only way to play the game on your computer was through a web browser, and you'd also be playing the Flash version of the game as well. Well, actually, that isn't fully true, because BTD5 Deluxe was launched on August 14th of 2012, but I'll get to that in a moment. However, when playing on the standard Flash version of BTD5 that was online, players quickly found themselves reaching a bottleneck. The record shot up from around 200 around the time that the game was launched to around 500 just 2 years later in late 2013. But then, any sort of progress to the record slowed down immensely. It took nearly a year after round 500 for someone to increase the record to round 574, and the worst part about this is that both Big Cube Fan, the player who achieved round 500, and the Lapras Man, who's the one that achieved 574, actually had their games end because of a crash as opposed to their defenses failing, which is partially because having to play BTD5 through a web browser made it a lot more unstable, especially considering that Adobe Flash already isn't the most optimal game engine out there. But let's come back to BTD5 Deluxe for a second, which still had been coded using Flash, but if you were willing to fork over $15, you got a version of the game with better graphics and more towers, not to mention that this was also the first version of BTD5 that was able to be downloaded and played offline directly on your computer as well, making it potentially a great deal more stable. In fact, for around 2 years, you could actually find this version of the game directly on Steam. But there's just one problem. You see, BTD5 Deluxe should have been the key to getting well past the limits that the regular version of BTD5 was finding at this time, considering that the extra towers it had includes the Bloon Chipper, which you probably know is insanely broken for its ability to suck in literally any bloon and deal insane damage to it while also stalling it for you as well. And like I was just saying, with this also being a downloadable game, it would be a lot more stable for you as well, but the issue here was actually quite simple. Once you get to round 500 in BTD5 Deluxe, the game actually sends you infinite ZOMGs, which never allows you to progress to the next round. So that wasn't gonna help. But everything changed on November 4th of 2014. When the Steam store page for Bloons TD5 Deluxe would be changed itself, as they actually dropped Deluxe from the game's title, along with an update to the description of the game that now reflected the version that we have on mobile. And yeah, just 2 weeks later on the 19th, it became official. You could no longer purchase BTD5 Deluxe, but instead would get the newest version of BTD5, which was coded on C++. A much stronger game engine, and therefore is a lot more stable than any version of the game coded on Flash could ever be. And naturally, this was the first time that we really ever saw the limits of BTD5 freeplay make a giant leap forwards, as players now had all the great parts of BTD5 Deluxe, being able to use the Bloon Chipper and having the game available offline, but it also came without that pesky round 500 limit or any of the drawbacks that would come with having to play the Flash version of the game. And so, it would only take about 6 months for the Lapras Man to get all the way up to around 1000 using a relatively basic 12 temple setup on express shipping, with the rest of his map filled with Bloon Chippers, spare a few Absolute Zero Ice Monkeys, and Bloon Sabotage Ninjas to slow everything down. I only call this setup basic because it is possible to fit up to 17 temples on the Steam version of this map, However, on Flash, express shipping was never really an option because it only allows you to place towers directly on the crates in that version of the game, whereas on Steam, you can place them just about anywhere on the map, spare for the track itself of course. And express shipping is by far the longest map in either version of this game, so having it become viable for free play was another huge plus. But what if you could find a way to create more space for yourself than the game ever intended you to have? Enter tower stacking, which was first popularized by none other than Super John Bombo, otherwise known as SJB, in this video from July 3rd of 2015. And I'll let him explain exactly how it actually worked at the time.
We're going to use an exploit in the game. We're going to move temples as close as we can together. We're going to get more than 100 temples on this map. Check this out. We got the helicopter, the 2-4 helicopter. We're going to move the sun god over near the temple as close as we possibly can. But then, before the helicopter goes and grabs the sun god, we're going to upgrade it. We're going to upgrade it to a temple. Check this out. The helipilot will indeed move the temple. So if you guys know anything about temples, you know you can't move a temple. But if you move a sun god that turns into a temple, we can move them as close as we can together. So check it out. We already have almost 25 temples in the top right corner there.
It's also worth mentioning that he was actually playing on a map called Lobby at the time, which is definitely not as good for setting records on, and still, he was able to match the Lapras man with this powerful new glitch. And speaking of Lapras, he would fire back just 2 months after SJB matched him on September 18th of 2015 using tower stacking for himself in order to achieve a new world record of around 1,500, showing just how much better that express shipping really is. Just a couple months later, this record would be increased to around 1,700 by a player named Adja, but at this point, it seemed as though BTD5 was nearing its limit once again, as the new record would go on to stand for the next 5 years. Not because nobody could beat it though, but rather it was actually because Ninja Kiwi themselves actually patched the ability to specifically stack temples on top of each other out of the game. And I say temples specifically because from what I've found, as far as 8 years ago, players still knew how to stack other towers, but nobody in the community actually believed it was possible to stack temples together specifically anymore. I don't know about anybody else, but for me, the difference between 2015 and 2020 feels like it's far bigger than 5 years, considering everything that happened with COVID and just a really weird feeling of time dilation in general. The world just felt like a different place 10 years ago compared to only 5, and it would specifically take until November 24th of 2020 for a player by the name of Jort to finally surpass Adja's around 1,700 record that was set back in 2015. The crazy thing about this new record though is the fact that the community still believed there was no way to actually stack temples anymore, and thus Jort managed to get all the way to around 2,728 without the help of that glitch or any tower stacking in general for that matter. Just for reference, the previous record set without tower stacking was actually by none other than Matteo himself, who had gotten up to around 1,500, and that's quite impressive, but he actually told me that at the time of setting this record, he believed the limits of the game to only be around the 2,000 mark. So what allowed Jort to get so much further? Well, this is where the next limit break for BTD5 really comes into play, as Jort was the first person to begin using the helicopter monkey for something that wasn't related to stacking towers. Because of course, the support Chinook's primary function is its ability to generate crates of extra cash and lives, with the latter being quite valuable. Because what Jort realized is that if he kept enough of these helicopters around during his free play attempt, he could farm so many extra lives that it would allow him to survive for far longer than anyone ever imagined to be possible before. Matteo had also considered life farming, but wrote it off back then as he believed you wouldn't be able to farm enough extra lives to actually make that much of a difference. But clearly, this turned out not to be true, as Jort would be able to build a really strong defense, having the glitchless maximum of 17 temples on express shipping, along with a couple villages that are using the bigger beacons upgrade to cover the entire map, and of course an army of balloon shippers with a few ninja monkeys and ice towers to slow down all the balloons as well. Not to mention, he still had 8 support Chinook helicopters to farm him more lives even as late as around 1500. And by 1887, Jort had managed to farm more than 30 million extra lives, which means that he had already surpassed the current record by nearly 200 rounds, but also, combined with having such a strong defense built up, he could continue pushing forward as well, as you only start losing a couple thousand lives per round when you initially start getting overwhelmed in BTD5 when you have this much defense. The Moab class balloons are gradually gaining a bit of extra speed and health every round, so the rate at which you start losing lives is also quite gradual, meaning that with more than 30 million of them, Jort was able to get all the way up to around 2,729, which is where he failed, and the way that we consider records is to say that he reached around 2,728, with that being the highest one that he had beaten. And of course, this was something that up until this point, nobody else in the community really even believed to be possible. After Jort had set the bar so high, it would take another few years for anyone else to challenge his record. A player by the name of Alexa would post this screenshot of them having lost around 3,001 on June 27th of 2023, but unlike Jort, they didn't post any videos of the run. However, apparently, Alexa had farmed over 300 million extra lives as opposed to Jort's 30 million, which means that if everything is legitimate with this record, it would mark the very first time that a player used one of the game's special agents, the Banana Farmer with its pro version unlocked specifically, in order to indefinitely stall the early rounds and give themselves way more time to farm extra lives with, or at least the first time that this was specifically done to actually set a world record in the game. As you can see here, the Banana Farmer Pro is capable of sending balloons backwards without actually dealing damage to them, and if you combine this with 0-0 ice towers and a glue gunner that doesn't have corrosive glue specifically, it's quite easy to ensure that slower balloons, even greens in this case, can never escape, so the round won't end until you decide to pop them. Naturally, this was yet another way that players now had to further push the limits of BTD5 free play, and everything really came to a head on August 7th of 2024, as this would be the day that Matteo Blooner began farming extra lives with the same method, but the only difference was, he was finally able to stack temples on top of each other as well, something that wouldn't be seen in a world record run since Aj's round 1700 from 2015. I'm not exactly sure when it happened, but at some point between late 2023 and mid 2024, people realized that temple stacking had not actually been fully patched out of the game. And so it was still possible to get them really close together using the same method, or pretty much so, that had been around nearly a decade before. And with it, Matteo was able to fit a total of 65 temples that were packed together on his map with nearly 272 million extra lives as well, resulting in another huge BTD5 limit break, as he pushed all the way up to around 4,114 before finally losing. The amount of dedication that actually goes into a run like this is nothing short of insane, despite the fact that Matteo had used a helicopter specialist building to make their landing pads take up 20% less space, and he also double stacked them in order to have 125 support Chinooks in total. It still took about a month for him to actually farm over a 250 million extra lives, although to be fair, he wasn't running the game 24/7 or anything, but it was still a couple hundred hours of real time, and since he had been stalling the rounds as well, Matteo was only at round 244 by the time that his defense had fully been built, and the run itself wasn't completed until January 9th of 2025, just over 5 months after Matteo had begun farming extra lives. To be fair, there was a point after he started farming them that he actually wasn't playing the game for a couple months, so it took longer than it should have, but definitely the run was around 2.5 months of actual playtime within BTD5, and that is a pretty crazy level of dedication for a game that's been out for over a decade now and literally doesn't even have much player base left, with the 6th game taking most people away from it. And I think it's fair to say that in order to achieve anything higher than Matteo's record of around 4,114, you wouldn't just be testing the limits of the game, but also the limits of human patience at this point as well. You would think that after setting such a huge world record, Matteo would have decided to chill for a while, like pretty much every player had before him. I mean, he literally spent months on a single run, but that couldn't have been further from what Matteo would actually do, as exactly 1 month after getting to round 4,114, he was already doing this. And you might notice that the helicopters look a whole lot different compared to the previous run. Somehow, they're not just double stacked anymore, but seem to be placed literally wherever Matteo desires. And despite taking up far less space, he even has more of them, 180 to be exact. You might also be inclined to ask why he doesn't get even more than that if there is seemingly no limit at all, but 180 activated abilities is the most that you're able to effectively use, and I'll explain why. Well, to be more accurate, the number really would be around 177 or 178, and basically, what Matteo is doing to farm extra lives is using an old battery to actually hold down the hotkey that activates each Chinook ability, as holding down the key allows you to achieve the maximum of 1 ability use per frame, or 30 abilities per second. So no matter how many towers that you get, it's impossible to farm lives any more quickly than this rate, and thus you only want to have just enough to where you're able to constantly activate new abilities 100% of the time. And this number turns out to be just about 180 because once you have your Monkey Knowledge Laboratory maxed out, it gives you a 30% reduction to ability cooldowns, and then you get a 50% reduction from the Energy Beacon Village, despite the game telling you it's only 20%, and on top of that, running the game on fast forward mode, specifically without the auto round start enabled, actually makes the game 4 times faster as well, meaning that it takes a little under 6 seconds for each ability's cooldown to end, and multiply 6 seconds by 30 ability uses per second, and you get 180 helicopters required to maintain the maximum rate of life farming. But this still doesn't answer the question, how was Matteo able to actually stack his helicopters like this in the first place? Well, shortly after he set his round 4,114 record back in January of this year, something pretty insane would happen. You see, back in 2024, another BTD5 expert by the name of Silvia would actually find a way where you could literally double stack temples for the first time, effectively doubling the amount that Matteo could have had during his old record, but then, while attempting to show this to her friend in January of this year, that friend would end up doing something that allowed them to literally place a tower on the track for the very first time in BTD5. And this was absolutely huge because effectively, they were able to get a tower in a completely illegal spot that otherwise the game would have deemed as invalid. Before this, there was no way to get a tower literally wherever you wanted it. The way that double stacking regular towers worked before is that you were simply tricking the game by moving a certain tower to a spot with your support Chinook and then immediately placing a second tower in that spot, since the game wouldn't deem that space invalid until the tower had already been moved. So yeah, effectively you could have 2 towers on top of each other. You can't use the support Chinook to move temples though, so that's why this trick never worked with them, and Silvia's old escape glitch would have allowed you to actually double stack temples for the first time, but once her friend found this method of literally placing a tower anywhere you want, that just didn't even matter anymore, because obviously you can put as many towers on top of other towers as you want if literally no space in the game is considered invalid whatsoever. And if you're wondering how this works, all you really have to do is go and actually start to move a tower with one support Chinook ability, then go to move it with a second ability, but don't let go of your left mouse click. Keep on holding down the mouse button, use the escape key to force the game to pause despite the fact that you're in the middle of using an ability, keep on holding your mouse down, drag your mouse over to wherever you actually want the tower to be placed, and you'll notice that when I let go, the ability actually does something, even though the game is paused. And this basically just bypasses the game knowing what is and isn't an invalid placement, and yeah, it will just put the tower wherever you want it to be. Doing this with temples though is far more complicated, since you can't actually move the temple itself. You're going to have to move the sun god first and have it go to a spot where it can then be upgraded to a temple, but before it actually gets upgraded you have to use a second ability to move it so that the game still thinks it's moving a sun god when in reality it's going to be moving a temple. I mean, this is pretty similar to how temple stacking worked before, but now of course you can literally put them in invalid spots, including on top of other temples. And hopefully this demonstration in the background's been helping. It's obviously not mine, but rather from a player named Albie, who I've mentioned many times on this channel. He's a great friend of mine and one of the greatest players that this game has ever seen. And with such a huge discovery coming from Silvia and her friend, you could literally stack as many temples as you wanted now. or realistically, as many as your PC will be able to handle. But before doing that, Matteo decided that instead of farming 250 million extra lives, he would go all the way and farm to the actual limit of this game, which is quite literally the 32-bit integer limit itself. I should specifically say that it is the signed 32-bit integer limit, which actually does cut the number in half, but in total, Matteo was able to farm 2,147,000,000 extra lives over the course of 40 days of non-stop playtime. At this point, he would begin setting up his final defense, and you can see he quickly took advantage of the new stacking glitch once again to have 100 temples smack dab in the center of express shipping, which honestly just looks insane. Matteo did stop himself from going too crazy though, settling on 169 temples along with the standard bigger beacons, monkey villages, balloon chippers, and ninja and ice monkeys. And now, all that was left for Matteo to do was simply wait, as he worked his way towards beating his own record. Of course, I mentioned in this video how he's gotten past round 10,000 as of today, but what's really crazy about that is that even when Matteo was beginning his current record back in February, most people still didn't believe round 10,000 to actually be possible, and Matteo himself was even unsure. So he literally went into this attempt not knowing that he would get as far as he did. But about 1 month into his run, Matteo would discover something that not only made him certain it was possible, but would also put a new limit on the table that nobody had ever imagined or really even dreamed of to actually be something that players might one day achieve. But before I get to that, I'll say that Matteo had surpassed his old record by May 20th of this year, which means it did take him a couple less months this time, and that's mostly because Matteo was now basically running the game 24/7 on a second computer. By the 31st of May, he would crack the round 5,000 mark while only having lost around 5 million lives thus far, less than 0.25% of what he had total. 2 weeks later, he was past round 6,000, another 2 weeks would see the 7k mark reached, and Matteo's life count had finally slipped under 2 billion at this point as well. Over the next few months, he would push his way closer and closer to that coveted 10k mark, but then the universe itself stepped in to actually try to stop it from happening. At least, that would have been the case if it hadn't been for Matteo's discovery back in March. As you can see here, by around 9,945, he had just under 50 million lives left, but by 9,966, that was down to just under 20 million. And common sense tells us that with such a rate of loss, he probably would have failed right around 9,980 or so. And so, how did Matteo avoid the inevitable? Well, on round 9,969 specifically, he sold all of his defense. Wait, that doesn't make any sense. Well, he actually did get 2 crippled Moab snipers, because what Matteo discovered is that even with the ZOMGs moving at lightning speed by this point in the game, if he perfectly timed 2, or better yet, 3 of them, he could still manage to permanently stall the last ZOMG at the end of each round. Well, I shouldn't say permanently, but with how much extra health that they have at this point, and how little that the damage from a crippled Moab sniper is relative to that, the 3 snipers will take literally several hours to actually finally pop the ZOMG down. All the while, Matteo can farm extra lives in the process. Of course, by not having a proper defense, he's having to allow everything besides the last ZOMG to leak through each round, but the Moab class balloons don't take extra health just because they've gained it from free play, and what I mean by that is that the RBE of the round will always tell you how many lives you're going to lose regardless of any sort of free play scaling. And this actually averages out to about 2.5 million lives per round when you're this far into free play. But the fact that the crippled Moab sniper method gives you several extra hours to farm lives per round, the net gain is still a little over 10 million lives every single round, which should really only go up if you continue pushing further and further as the ZOMGs will only continue to gain more health. Initially though, Matteo only used this method to farm about 50 million extra lives so that he could ensure round 10,000 would be reached, before rebuilding his defense, which actually took a few hours on its own. And that's when it became official. Matteo accomplished the unthinkable and became the first and currently only person to see a 5-digit round number in BTD5 legitimately. although another player named Smeal is actually getting pretty close to 10k themselves, so really gotta give a huge shout out to them too. But at this point, Matteo took a well-earned break, although it's hard to actually call it much of a break when he still was doing other challenge runs in the game, but I guess some people just have Bloons Tower Defense basically coded into their genetics. And this break really only lasted for a month and a half anyways, before Matteo would begin using the sniper stall trick to farm extra lives once again, with his plan being to continue going until he gets all the way back up to the integer limit once again, at which point Matteo actually will not be rebuilding his defense anymore, but rather he told me it would be a lot faster to simply allow all of the balloons to leak through each round until he gets close to running out of lives again. It actually makes a lot of sense, because realistically speaking, if you're only going to lose 2.5 million lives per round, you could easily survive for about 800 or even 900 of them with 2.147 billion extra lives in total. Of course, this process is not a very quick one though, with Matteo currently sitting at about 1,755,000,000 lives as of the release of this video, which happens to be on New Year's Eve of 2025. Keep in mind that he began farming lives again on October 25th. So yeah, this strategy is going to take an incredibly long time to actually pull off. Matteo also has to specifically place the 3 snipers at the beginning of each round to make sure that their timing is perfect as well, so it's not even like this run can fully be AFK or something either. But this is where we're at in BTD5. In order to see the world record be pushed any further, Matteo himself has to spend months at a time farming extra lives, during which he can only beat like 5 rounds a day since they're being stalled out for so long, and then he gets to use all those lives to survive for about 900 rounds until he has to repeat the process all over again. But you might be wondering, is there any limit to how far this new sniper stalling strategy can actually get you? Well, as it turns out, the answer is yes. But that limit is far beyond anything we could have ever imagined even just 1 year ago. Matteo was kind enough to send me this video of him testing it out, where on round 81,000, using a total of 10 cripple Moab snipers now, he was just barely able to catch a ZOMG in time before it would have been able to escape. And what he told me is that when testing 82,000, he could no longer catch it at all. So the current limit of BTD5 is somewhere between round 81 and 82,000, plus however many rounds you end up surviving for once you're done farming to the 32-bit integer limit for the very last time. Although, if we're being realistic, it's gonna take Matteo around an entire decade to actually get to that point. But he isn't planning on stopping anytime soon, so maybe I'll be back in 10 years with some kind of update on this. But who's to say in that time something else won't be discovered that makes round 80,000 seem tiny in comparison, the same way that round 80,000 now makes the current world record seem like it's a lot smaller than it really is. I really hope you'll enjoy this video. And again, huge shout out to Matteo for helping to make it possible, along with Silvia, who was very quick to answer a question I had about her escape stacking method as well. Both of their channels will be linked in the description below, and if you enjoyed this video, here's another one that YouTube picked out just for you.